Okay, we'll get started with ePractice Manager's webinar today. Thank you for joining us. We're going to cover a subject that seems to be on everybody's mind in the field right now, which is getting a practice restarted after a crisis having to do with the COVID-19 virus and the implications of that all over the world, actually. So up until this point, ePractice Manager and everyone really has been addressing subjects such as, and what we've had in front of us have been the subjects about closing offices, having to do with a containment issue. And that spun off a lot of issues having to do with human resources in a practice, the temporary furloughing of staff, modified work schedules, canceling patient schedules and accounting only for emergency care, the funding of a practice, and the temporary budgeting and deferral of payments, perhaps loans to cover deficits, and a lot of subjects along that line. Somewhat happily, we are now moving into the phase where, not right now, but right in front of us are the issues that are related to reopening a practice, and it's going to have its complexities associated with it. But we've had a lot of clients who've said, well, during this time, we're going to have staff and doctors with some extra time on their hands, and we're going to do a lot of project work, and we're going to get to these issues that we never have before, or we're going to start preparing for reopening the practice and making sure that we're ready to relaunch. And what I hear from people every day is that as we've actually moved into that phase, these things are largely unorganized and not particularly efficient. So what we want to cover today is what to do in anticipation of reopening a practice, and how to reduce the time involved with that. One of the things that we know is that practices have had issues all along. They have a whole host of new issues as a result of this situation. We don't want to put practices, practice owners, managers, staff in the situation of having to invent the solutions to common problems and these new issues that have arisen at the time that you're bringing patients back into your office. That would be a difficult way to navigate things. So we're trying to get ahead of the game, cover the areas that need to be addressed well in advance. We have put together a practice reboot checklist, which is already being used by our customers and clients to some degree, and will be implemented throughout their experience. But we're making this available to others so that practices and doctors and managers have the help that they need along this line. So we're just going to briefly go through some of the steps having to do with the checklist, making sure that you've got a view of the things that are involved, and hopefully this will assist you in the implementation as well. So the first thing that we know is that there are going to be compliance and regulation issues that arise. One of the complexities having to do with this is that regional or they're changing. So it's important for ePractice Manager as a company and for our clients on an individual basis to ensure that we have a mechanism for continually reviewing the regulations and making sure that we can ensure compliance with those. The government websites for any particular state, the Board of Dentistry, the American Dental Association, the specialty associations have all been pretty good about publishing that information as it becomes available. Most importantly, the Department of Health and governors for each state are putting together a lot of information about expectations having to do with reopening. So just ensuring that folks are on top of that, checking those things pretty regularly. The next step that we want to get involved with is anticipation of the idea that we're going to have PPE issues to deal with moving forward. Now, this can be reduced down to just the subject of ordering. It's not quite as simple as that. So definitely these steps apply, but we need to understand that not only for compliance reasons, but also for image reasons and for true safety reasons, we have to be on top of this like never before. The public is going to have a different attitude towards the idea of sanitary conditions and contagion and things like that. So it's a matter of making sure that we're prepared for this on all levels. First priority is safety always. Second priority is we need to communicate about those safety standards and make sure that the public feels comfortable with that and that we take all the steps that we can. One of the small points to stay on top of here is that as it relates to PPE, it's not a good idea to wait until you reopen your practice and then resume your ordering schedule. We want to make sure that you are regularly and as often as possible participating in routine ordering, because the capacity for that, the availability of that, even simple things like the shipping of certain items is going to become complicated. So we're certainly not talking about some sort of hoarding issue, but on the other hand, we need to have some regularity involved with ordering. And again, this goes back to staying on top of the input sources that you have for what these regulations are going to be. There are no federal, state, or state guidelines that have been issued at this point, to my knowledge, that have to do with exact, precise items or materials that need to be used, but we anticipate that some version of that will come into play. So the next step that we need to pay attention to is, believe it or not, marketing. And it's a small piece of the marketing picture, and we'll get into some more of this in a minute, but a lot of practices have made, as far as their online presence goes, some sort of adjustment to keep the patients and, for a specialist, the referring practices, aware of what your practice situation is. Perhaps you have posted some version of reduced hours. Perhaps you've changed your contact method as you're routing calls differently. People have added banners and things like that to their website. Even for those who are involved in keywords, AdWords types of campaigns, they changed those over largely to emergency care. So we need to make sure that as you're confronting the idea of reopening your practice, even on a limited basis, that you go ahead and update those things. We know that in the past, when we've been faced with office closures, and this is for reasons of perhaps there's a tornado or a hurricane in a particular area, those offices have been closed for months at a time. We know that some of the things that people are faced with in terms of returning to practice, certainly it's not the same thing at all as everybody doing that at the same time. But these are the things that go unintended, right? We forget that we made these changes and don't adjust them back to what they should be, or adjust them routinely. Perhaps you're going to ramp up the opening of your practice, and those hours and contact methods need to be updated appropriately. So the next step of paying attention to these reopening issues has to do with the idea of staff. Most practices have some version of a schedule reduction going on with staff, and it becomes a pretty complicated issue. Of course, we want staff to be compensated either through the practice efforts or the assistance programs that are in play. A lot of details that have to do with how those things tie together, meeting the needs of the practice and meeting the needs of the staff at the same time. We want to retain the staff. We certainly don't want to be reopening a practice with staff having left or changes of situation. So we do want to care for staff. One of the things that we know is that we're going to be faced with bringing staff back before we bring patients back. It would simply be an improper sequence and an unrealistic expectation for us to expect that we could bring staff and patients back on the same day and have everything move forward standardly. So we're going to need to make sure that the scheduling accounts for the idea that the staff are returned to the office perhaps a week ahead of time to make sure that we can cover the bases on basically what amounts to the rest of the checklist. So moving forward, we want to take a look at an issue that doesn't get enough attention even in a regular practice environment. I want to take a moment to talk about the patient schedule. Almost every ePractice manager, client, and customer visits and revisits this territory as they move through a management program. Practice patient schedule can be largely unoptimized and run inefficiently. This happens on a day-to-day basis. We can certainly anticipate that as we're returning to practice, that situation will be exacerbated. So one of the things that we have all of our clients doing right now is reviewing the template that exists in your practice for patient scheduling. If you don't have one, this is a great time to create a template for patient scheduling. We have those available for you if you want assistance in this area. But this is something that needs a tremendous amount of attention, even insofar as we've learned some lessons. For those practices that are now conducting emergency care, we've had to practice a certain way, we've had to schedule a certain way, and we've learned some things about that. Perhaps doctor preferences have come into play, or patient acceptance has come into play, and we want to retain the best parts of what we've learned, but we also want to schedule for efficiency. As we return to a full schedule, if we just answer the phone, schedule the patients who are calling us, and place them wherever on the schedule, we can anticipate weeks of an unoptimized, non-productive schedule. Whereas if we have a good schedule template, if we train our staff according to that, and if we route our patients into a well-organized scheduling template, it does a few things for us. Number one, we can expand it as we move into full scale. But the other thing is that we can actually help more patients and make it easier on the team that's returning to work to provide that care. We can have a more productive schedule, and while it's not at the center, financial concerns and a practice getting back up to productivity is certainly one of the issues that we need to take a look at. So moving forward, we want to take a look at the idea that staff do need to be trained on this. Your schedule, if it is unoptimized, has been unoptimized for a reason. Staff at the front office are largely doing what they think is the best thing, and we know that they face challenges having to do with that. So one of the things that we need to account for in bringing staff back ahead of patients is that we're going to have to do some training. We're going to have to schedule, put together a schedule template and train the staff on that, but also most offices have some sort of a protocol for handling patient triage, whether that's done formally or informally, and we have a training session for you on that. We have some documentation for you on that. A lot of practices already have it. We're triaging almost in reverse now, right? Where we're not trying to manipulate time in the same way. So we have patients who are contacting us and they do or don't want to see us, or we're contacting them and they do or don't want to see us. Well, we've got a set of questions that we can ask them, and it's got to incorporate some of the new safety standards, right? We have to screen them for different travel and health situations than we have before, but we also have to put them in order in terms of the importance of emergency care. People who have care that's mid-treatment, they're in the middle of cooperative care with another practice, those things are going to need some prioritized attention. So please account for some training of your staff along the line of the schedule template, and make sure that there's time for that. If we wait until the phone starts ringing or the patients start coming, they are going to revert to the things that they've always done, and the schedule will revert back to the inefficiencies that it's had in the past. So moving forward from this point, we want to take a look at reporting. What do we want to do as far as the practice's initiation point having to do with patients? Not just defensively waiting for the phone to ring with either referrals from other practices or patients calling us, but we need to take a look at the reporting that we can run and make sure that we cover all the bases. We have a lot of practices that are revisiting former days and weeks of the patient schedule to ensure that everybody has been transferred forward into a new appointment or transferred forward into a list for contact. We would like, even if we're wrong, even if we know that this is not entirely predictable, to get to a point where we can start scheduling patients when they call us, and when we call them, instead of putting them on a list for later contact. This is largely a capture issue. We know that people's priorities will change as we reopen society, if you will. People are going to have certain financial concerns, certain health concerns, and they'll be returning to work or dealing with family matters. So we don't necessarily know that everybody's disposition towards their care is going to be right where you left it when you stop talking to them. So one of the ways to mitigate this is to pick a date for your patient's schedule and start routinely scheduling people according to the template after that date. Now, of course, it's true that you may have to move that date depending on the regulations in play, but we would rather be in a position of rescheduling an appointment than trying to start this idea from inception with a patient who may or may not have this at the forefront of their thinking right now. So this is an important point. We want to make sure that we take the lead as it relates to running the right reports, reviewing the past schedule, making contact with anyone who is or should be in our maintenance program if you're a general practice and or a perio practice, and that they are accounted for on your schedule. People who are in the middle of treatment, people who have started treatment, not completed it, but also those who have been seen for consultation purposes and have not accepted treatment. It can be an under tended to part of the practice, whereas those conditions have largely changed for people over time, and they may be interested where they weren't before or they weren't able to before. So the next point that we want to start talking about having to do with this checklist has to do with an interesting thing. We've made some gains, and I don't necessarily want to categorize it that way or use inappropriate words that make it sound like something has been advantageous during this time, because that would be very inappropriate. But by necessity, we have had to change. We've had to adapt, and there are some things that we want to take with us into the future operation of a practice. And this is an opportunity, and there is no other way to look at it than that. Whereas you may have let the patients dictate a lot of the intake process into your practice previously, because people are dealing with keeping the number of patients in the practice low at any given time, we've had to adapt that. We've had to have people give us their information in advance and not rely on the idea that they'll do it when they're in the office. We've had to rely on the idea that people are giving us their insurance information, whereas we may have said before, oh, we can't get that from them ahead of time, they're not comfortable with it. We've employed certain digital means of communication. A lot of our clients are working with a telemedicine format now, and whereas we thought that may have been something difficult to incorporate or get acceptance with our clients, they, to the contrary, have taken that on and really love it and are using it, and are intending to keep that as part of the practice moving forward. Because of staff reductions, a lot of practices are using some form of e-contact, either emails or postings on your website or text messages or things like that. We're using that more than during normal practice times, and there's going to be a bit of that that's going to stay with the practice. So the point of all of this is to make sure that we're staying connected with our patients. We can't expect, and some practices are in this situation, that we don't talk to them for months at a time, and that, again, that intensity or prioritization of their care is going to remain at the forefront. So this is a means for practices to stay in touch with patients, perhaps referring practices. Make sure that you are talking to them about their care, make sure that you're talking to them about your ability to provide it, giving them reassurance, answering questions that they have, handling any complications that come up along the way, and retaining these processes. Sometimes the front office in a practice is developing a script, and they're finding that the way that they talk to patients is more or less effective. Well, that's going to be the case for a while, having to do with this subject. So we want to make note of the things that are working in our communication with patients. We want to share it with the other front office staff members, with the marketing department, with the office manager, even with the back office, so that as we continue to communicate with patients, we're striking the right tone and getting the right results from those conversations. Next point having to do with the checklist is that we are anticipating that we're going to have the need for some additional consent, right? If not for regulatory reasons or liability reasons, then for the fact that it's on the patient's minds. So ePractice Manager has, and so do several other resource outlets for you, have information about expanded consents, additional verbiage that you can use to let people know not only about the risks involved with getting care during these times, but also what you're doing to address those particular points. And you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. Definitely accomplish the consent, but we can ease the minds of our patients and those who refer to our practice by letting them know about our compliance, letting them know about our dedication to the standards and things like that. Next point having to do with this is we do have specialty practices that we're working with, so we'll take a moment to go over the point that specialists, and a lot of this is happening organically, but they need to be in touch with those who refer to them more than ever. Find out what those practices are doing, find out what needs they have, let them know what you're doing, what your schedule is like, what your capacity is like, and provide some reassurance. Again, not to sound opportunistic or advantageous, but we have a lot of specialists who have found that the other specialists in their area have closed altogether or have struggled with providing even emergency care. So they've, struck up some relationships with doctors that don't necessarily always refer to them, but are certainly appreciative of the coverage that they've gotten during this time, and anticipate receiving referrals from those practices in the future. So that's an important point. We also need to make sure that we consolidate information for those who do refer to us. So as we're confronting the idea of reopening a practice, we want to make sure that instead of just cooperative care letters going one at a time on a per patient basis to referring doctors, particularly at the time of reopening, we should consolidate for them a list of those patients that are midstream on care, our shared patients, and where they stand with treatment and what we need to do to move those things forward. And that will be appreciated. So these are the basics of what we want to be involved with, having to do with reopening a practice. Again, the entire subject has to do with the idea that the longer that it takes for you to reopen an efficient, well-oiled, productive practice, the longer that the financial repercussions of having been closed will continue to haunt a practice, and we want to make sure that we make that the shortest runway as possible. As of now, these are the subjects that will get you there faster than anything else. As a summary, we had some questions that were submitted ahead of time, and wanted to share those with you. Number one is, what should I be doing right now? I think that largely we've covered that. We want to make sure, especially with matters having to do with a plan for bringing staff back, a plan for the patient schedule, plan for the retention of the electronic communication methods that you've used, and a plan for marketing exists, and that the staff are re-entered into the practice with those plans in place, with the steps having to do with those plans assigned to them. We want to resume patient contact as early and as often as possible. But again, backfilling, there are some preparatory steps. That schedule template, even if you have one and it's great, the circumstances have changed. So we're going to have to revisit that. The marketing plan, even if you have one, that's great, but the circumstances have changed. So things like that that require preparatory steps can be done by doctors and managers now, so that when staff come back, they receive very specific training and instruction and can ramp up and move forward easily. I guess another question that we've received a lot does have to do with marketing, the marketing of a practice. And it's one of those things that we have been focusing a lot on with our clients by necessity. They're asking us, what should I be doing for marketing right now? We touched lightly on the idea that continuously a little bit more attention to the time interval having to do with your online presence and the adapting of those things has certainly come into play. But whatever your regular marketing efforts are, we need to make sure that those, perhaps during this time, they've gotten some more attention from the doctor, and that's wonderful. But the doctor is going to return to care and not necessarily have the time to devote the same amount of attention to this. So as we move forward, one of the big things to know is who's going to be in charge of marketing for the practice as we move on. Is it going to be a combination of the efforts of various staff? Has that been announced? Has it been scheduled? Have they been trained for their piece of the situation? Or is there going to be a person who, either on a part-time or full-time basis, is going to be dedicating all of their effort to marketing of the practice? Well, marketing is something that does need to be covered quite a bit. And in fact, now more than ever, it will have different messaging, and we understand that. It's not going to necessarily be an entirely gangbusters type of messaging, but there are a lot of people who need care, and there are a lot of people who aren't sure how to get it, and a lot of people who aren't sure how to afford it, and a lot of people who aren't sure if it's safe to move forward with that. So our messaging has to be adapted to the circumstances we're faced with, but practices largely will shortcut how many people they're talking to, how wide their outreach is, how frequently they're doing those things. So I would say that one of the big things moving forward is accounting for who's going to have the responsibility, what kind of time that they're going to have dedicated to that, and then adjusting the messaging and the output mechanism so that you can really do enough of it. This will have to do with reaching out to your existing patients, but also to your community and those who need your services in general. So I think that those are the main questions that we've gotten. If you have additional questions, please contact us using the information on the screen. One of the things that we know from working with practitioners over this time period is that customized solutions seem to be everything. People have gotten an awful lot of information from an awful lot of sources, and for the most part, that's general information. Our task has been to make that customized for each practice and its situations, and to help with the speed of the implementation of those steps. So please contact your practice manager. My contact information is on the screen. We're happy to help you with that. Looking forward to much success for the practices that really take on the initiative of getting back to a capacity to help others as quickly as possible. We all need to do our part of that, and we're moving into that phase quickly. So do let us know if we can help. Thank you so much. Bye.